Margaret Chen sat in the back of her black sedan, her fingers tapping impatiently against her leather briefcase. She glanced at her diamond watch for the third time in 5 minutes. They were stuck at a red light that her driver should have anticipated and avoided by taking the parallel street. But no, here they were, waiting like everyone else. "David, you could have taken Morrison Avenue," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We've made this trip at least 20 times. You should know the traffic patterns by now." In the driver's seat, David Martinez nodded without turning around. "Yes, ma'am." "Sorry, ma'am." Margaret sighed and looked out the tinted window. 3 months. She had given this man 3 whole months to learn the simple task of driving her from point A to point B, without complications. How hard could it be? She had hired drivers before, and they all figured it out within the first week. But David seemed to get worse with each passing day. It wasn't just the traffic issues. Last Tuesday, he had driven past her office building entirely, continuing for 2 blocks before she had to tell him to turn around. The week before that, he took her to the wrong restaurant, even though she had clearly said Lombardi's, not Lombardo's. And just yesterday, he nearly missed the exit to the airport, swerving across 2 lanes at the last second. Margaret had gripped her armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. The really frustrating part was that David seemed like a decent person. He was always on time, his car was spotlessly clean, and he dressed professionally. He opened doors, carried bags, and never complained. But when it came to the actual driving part, the main job he was hired to do, he was absolutely terrible. Margaret had built her real estate empire from nothing. She started with a tiny office and 1 property listing 20 years ago. Now at 48, she owned Chen Properties, one of the most successful real estate firms in the city. She had over 60 employees, managed properties worth hundreds of millions, and had a reputation for excellence that she guarded fiercely. That reputation meant everything to her. When clients saw her arriving late, flustered, or in a rushed state because her driver got lost, it reflected poorly on her entire operation. In her world, details mattered. Punctuality mattered. Competence mattered. "David, why are you slowing down?" Margaret asked as the car decelerated on an empty stretch of road. "Just being careful, ma'am," David replied quietly. "Careful of what?" "There's nothing here. We're going to be late." David pressed the accelerator slightly, but Margaret could see his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. She shook her head and returned to her phone, scrolling through emails about the day's crucial meeting. She was about to close a $12 million deal with the Patterson Group, investors who could take her company to the next level. This meeting had taken months to arrange, and she needed to be there early to review the final contracts. "Do you know where you're going?" Margaret asked as David seemed to hesitate at an intersection. "Yes, ma'am. The Patterson building downtown." "Then why did you just pause? This is a straight shot. You literally just drive straight for the next mile." "I know, ma'am. I'm sorry." Margaret pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to snap at him again. She had been patient, she told herself. She had been understanding. She had even overlooked several mistakes that would have gotten any other employee fired on the spot. But patience had its limits, and David was testing every single one of hers. The truth was, Margaret didn't understand what was wrong with him. She had checked his references before hiring him. His previous employer had given him a decent recommendation, though thinking back now it had been somewhat vague. Nothing specific about his driving skills, just general comments about him being reliable and hardworking. She should have dug deeper. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant, Jennifer. "Patterson Group confirmed for 9:30. "Don't be late," Margaret typed back quickly. "On my way." 15 minutes out. Except they weren't 15 minutes out. They were at least 20 minutes away. And that was if traffic cooperated and David didn't make any more mistakes. She felt her stress level rising, that familiar tightness in her chest that came before important meetings. She needed to be calm and focused when she walked into that boardroom, not anxious and irritated. "David, can you please speed up a bit? We're running behind." "Yes, ma'am." But the car's speed barely changed. Margaret noticed David's eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, then to the side mirrors, then back to the road. He seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. She had noticed this behavior before, but had assumed he was just not paying attention. Now it was starting to seem like something more, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. They passed a coffee shop where Margaret had a meeting scheduled for next week. Without thinking, she said, "Remember, next Thursday morning we need to be at Café Metropole at 8. David didn't respond. David, did you hear me? He startled slightly. Sorry, yes. Café Metropole, Thursday at 8. I've got it. Margaret made a mental note to send him a reminder the night before. Actually, she'd probably need to send him several reminders, and a map, and maybe the exact GPS coordinates. As they finally pulled up to the Patterson building, Margaret checked her watch. 9:32. She was late. Not terribly late, but late enough that the Patterson Group's executives would have already arrived and been waiting. It was unprofessional, and it made her look disorganized. Thank you, David, she said curtly as he opened her door. Be back here at noon. Don't be late and don't park somewhere that will take you 20 minutes to get back from like last time. Yes. Ma'am. Margaret hurried into the building, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She could already feel the meeting was off to a bad start. Sure enough, when she entered the conference room, the three executives from Patterson Group were seated and checking their phones with expressions that suggested they'd been waiting for more than just 2 minutes. Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay, Margaret said smoothly, setting down her briefcase and extending her hand. Traffic was worse than expected this morning. They stood and shook her hand, offering polite smiles, but Margaret could read the room. First impressions mattered in business, and arriving late to a $12 million negotiation was not the impression she wanted to make. As she settled into her chair and began pulling out contracts, Margaret's mind briefly returned to David. Something had to change. She couldn't continue like this, constantly stressed about whether her driver would get her places on time. She had a company to run, deals to close, and a reputation to maintain. Maybe it was time to cut her losses. She had given him more chances than she would have given anyone else. Perhaps it was actually cruel to keep him in a position where he was clearly struggling and failing. Maybe firing him would be doing both of them a favor. Margaret pushed the thought aside and focused on the meeting ahead. She would deal with the David situation later. Right now, she had investors to impress and a deal to close. But in the back of her mind, a decision was already forming. By the end of the day, she told herself, she would make the call. David Martinez's time as her driver was coming to an end. The Patterson meeting had gone well, despite the rocky start. Margaret managed to close the deal, and by the time she walked out of that conference room at 11:45, she had a signed contract worth $12 million in her briefcase. It should have been one of the best days of her career. But instead of feeling victorious, Margaret felt drained. The entire meeting she had been on edge, worried about whether David would actually show up on time to pick her up. It was exhausting, this constant anxiety about something that should have been the easiest part of her day. When she stepped outside the building at exactly noon, David was there, parked right in front. At least he got that part right. She slid into the back seat without a word, and they drove back to her office in silence. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back meetings, reviewing property contracts and speaking with potential clients. But in the quiet moments between calls, her mind kept returning to the same conclusion. She couldn't keep putting this off. David had to go. At 5:30, after most of the staff had already left for the day, Margaret called her assistant Jennifer into her office. I need you to prepare a severance package for David, Margaret said, not looking up from her computer screen. Standard 2 weeks' pay, and have it ready by tomorrow morning. Jennifer stood in the doorway, her expression uncertain. Are you sure, Ms. Chen? I mean, I know he's had some issues, but I'm sure, Margaret interrupted. It's not working out. He's had 3 months, and if anything, he's gotten worse, not better. I can't run a business worrying about whether my driver can find his way to basic locations. Jennifer nodded slowly. Okay, I'll have it ready first thing. And ask him to come to my office at 6. I want to get this done today. As Jennifer left, Margaret leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. She didn't enjoy firing people. In fact, she hated it. But sometimes it was necessary. David seemed like a nice enough person, but nice didn't pay the bills. Nice didn't get her to meetings on time. Nice didn't build successful companies. She had worked too hard to let something as simple as an incompetent driver damage her reputation. Other people depended on her employees, their families, her clients. She had responsibilities that went beyond being kind to someone who couldn't do their job properly. Margaret tried to focus on other work while she waited, but the minutes dragged by. At exactly 6 o'clock, there was a soft knock on her office door. Come in, Margaret called out. David entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He stood near the entrance, his hands clasped in front of him, waiting. He looked tired, Margaret noticed. There were dark circles under his eyes that she hadn't seen before, or maybe she just hadn't been paying attention. "David, please sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. He sat, his posture straight but his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder. He knew why he was here. Of course he knew. "David, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you deserve that," Margaret began, keeping her tone professional but not unkind. "This isn't working out. You've had 3 months to adjust to this position, and frankly, you're the worst driver I've ever employed." She watched for a reaction, but David's face remained neutral. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this all along. "You're constantly making mistakes," Margaret continued. "Getting lost, taking wrong turns, making me late to important meetings. Just this morning, I was late to a $12 million negotiation because of poor route planning. I've been patient. I've given you chances, but I can't continue like this." Margaret slid a manila envelope across her desk. "This is 2 weeks severance pay. That's more than generous considering the probationary period. You can collect your personal belongings and leave immediately. Security will escort you out." David reached for the envelope with hands that Margaret noticed were trembling slightly. He held it in his lap but didn't open it. For a long moment, he just sat there staring at the envelope. "Is there anything you want to say?" Margaret asked, feeling slightly uncomfortable with his silence. David looked up at her, and for just a second, Margaret thought she saw something in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or disappointment. But then it was gone, and his expression returned to that same neutral, distant look. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I understand." That response bothered Margaret more than she wanted to admit. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to defend himself or ask for another chance. Just quiet acceptance. It almost felt like he agreed with her assessment, like he knew he had been failing and had been waiting for this moment. "You can go," Margaret said, turning her attention back to her computer screen. She wanted this over with. "Jennifer will help you with any final paperwork." David stood up, still holding the envelope. He walked toward the door, his footsteps soft on the carpet. Margaret kept her eyes on her screen, determined not to watch him leave. This was a business decision, nothing more. She had made hundreds of difficult decisions in her career, and this was just another one. But just as David's hand touched the doorknob, her office door burst open. Jennifer practically stumbled into the room, her face pale and her phone clutched in her hand like it was a lifeline. Her eyes were wide, and she was slightly out of breath, as if she had been running. "Ms. Chen," Jennifer gasped. "You need to see this right now. Right now." Margaret frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "Jennifer, this isn't a good time. I'm in the middle of—" "Please," Jennifer interrupted, something she never did. Her voice was urgent, almost desperate. "You need to see this before he leaves. Please." David had frozen at the door, his back still turned. Jennifer rushed forward and thrust her phone directly in front of Margaret's face, her hand shaking. Margaret took the phone, irritated by the dramatic interruption, but the moment her eyes focused on the screen, her irritation evaporated, replaced by something cold and heavy in her stomach. It was a news article. The headline was in bold letters: "Local hero driver saves 23 children from burning school bus." And there, in the photograph, was David. Margaret's eyes scanned the article rapidly, her heart beginning to pound. School bus driver, electrical fire, 23 children, multiple trips back into the burning vehicle, smoke inhalation, burns, hero. She scrolled down, reading faster now. The incident had happened 6 months ago. David had been driving his regular route when the bus's electrical system caught fire. Instead of panicking, he had calmly pulled over, evacuated all the children, and then gone back inside 3 separate times to make absolutely certain no one was left behind. The article mentioned that several children had been frozen with fear, hiding under seats. David had found them all. He had carried some of them out himself. He had suffered smoke inhalation and second-degree burns on his arms and neck. He had been hospitalized for a week. Margaret's hands were shaking now. She scrolled further, finding another article, then another. Local news, national news, social media posts calling him a hero, photos of him receiving commendations from the fire department and the school district, and then she found the most recent article, dated just 2 weeks ago. An interview with a trauma specialist about first responders and PTSD. David had been diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder following the incident. The article explained how trauma affected people differently, how it could manifest as hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating, panic attacks, and, Margaret's stomach dropped, problems with tasks that used to be simple like driving. She looked up from the phone, her face drained of color. Jennifer was still standing there, tears in her eyes, and David was still at the door, his back to them both, the severance envelope gripped in his hand. For the first time in her career, Margaret Chen had no idea what to say. "David," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wait." But David was already turning the doorknob. He pulled the door open and stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded to Margaret like the loudest sound she had ever heard. Margaret stood frozen behind her desk, staring at the closed door. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. She could hear David's footsteps fading down the hallway, getting quieter and quieter until they disappeared completely. "Ms. Chen?" Jennifer's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked down at the phone still in her hand, at David's face in that photograph. He was standing in front of a burned-out school bus, surrounded by children and their parents. Some of the parents were hugging him, others were crying. The children were holding handmade thank you cards. She had just fired a hero, not just any hero. A man who had risked his life to save 23 children. A man who was suffering from trauma because he had done something incredibly brave. And instead of showing him compassion, instead of trying to understand what might be wrong, she had called him useless. She had judged him, criticized him, and thrown him out like he was nothing. The weight of what she had done hit her all at once. Margaret sank into her chair, the phone slipping from her fingers onto the desk. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What have I done?" Jennifer picked up her phone, her expression a mix of sympathy and something else. Disappointment, maybe. "I tried to tell you he was a good person. I tried to say something before you made the decision." Margaret looked up sharply. "You knew about this? You knew what happened to him?" "No, not the details," Jennifer admitted, "but I knew something was wrong. I could tell he was struggling with something. A few times when I brought him coffee, I saw him just sitting in the car staring straight ahead. Once I found him in the break room and he looked like he'd been crying. I asked if he was okay and he just said he was tired." Margaret felt sick. How had she missed all of this? She prided herself on being observant, on knowing what was happening in her company. But she had been so focused on efficiency, on punctuality, on her own convenience, that she hadn't seen the person right in front of her. "I need to find him," Margaret said suddenly, standing up. "I need to apologize. I need to—" She grabbed her phone and pulled up David's contact information. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then an automated voice. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Margaret tried again, thinking she must have misdialed. Same result. "He disconnected his phone," Jennifer said quietly. "He probably couldn't afford to keep paying for it after losing his job." The guilt hit Margaret like a physical blow. She rushed to her computer and pulled up David's employee file. There had to be an emergency contact, a family member, someone who could help her reach him. But the emergency contact section was blank. No names, no numbers. Under family, it simply said, "None listed." "What about his address?" Margaret asked, already scrolling through the file. "It's there," Jennifer said, leaning over to point at the screen. "Apartment 3B, 847 Riverside Street." Margaret grabbed her car keys and her purse. "I'm going there now." "Miss Chen, it's almost 7 o'clock. Maybe you should wait until tomorrow, give him some space." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I can't wait. I need to make this right tonight." She practically ran to the parking garage, her heels echoing in the empty concrete structure. Her hand shook as she started her car. She had to do this herself. She couldn't send Jennifer or someone else. This was her mistake, and she needed to face it directly. The drive to Riverside Street took 20 minutes. Margaret's mind raced the entire way, rehearsing what she would say. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you explain that you fired someone because you were too blind, too selfish, too wrapped up in your own world to see their pain? When she pulled up to 847 Riverside Street, her heart sank. It was a run-down apartment building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The paint was peeling and several windows had bars on them. This was where David lived? On what she paid him, he could barely afford this place? Margaret parked and hurried to the entrance. The front door was unlocked, the lock broken. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, her anxiety growing with each step. Apartment 3B was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. She knocked on the door. "David? It's Margaret Chen. Please, I need to talk to you." Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. "David, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But please, just give me 5 minutes. I need to apologize." Still nothing. Margaret knocked a third time, then a fourth. Finally, a door across the hallway opened, and an elderly woman poked her head out. "He's not there," the woman said. "I saw him leave about 30 minutes ago with boxes. Looked like he was moving out." Margaret's heart dropped. "Moving out? Do you know where he went?" The woman shook her head. "Didn't say. Just loaded up his car and drove off. Seemed like he was in a hurry." "Is he in some kind of trouble?" "No," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "No trouble. Thank you." She walked back to her car in a daze. David was gone. He had packed up and left within an hour of being fired. He probably couldn't afford the rent without a job. Or maybe he just wanted to get away from anything that reminded him of this latest failure. Margaret sat in her car and pulled out her phone. She opened the news article again and read it more carefully this time. The details were devastating. The article mentioned that David had been a school bus driver for 8 years, beloved by the children and respected by parents. After the fire, he had tried to return to work but found he couldn't do it anymore. The thought of driving a bus full of children triggered panic attacks so severe he had to pull over. So he had taken a job as a private driver instead. Something quieter, simpler, a way to keep working while he dealt with his trauma, and Margaret had made that impossible too. The article mentioned that David was attending therapy sessions twice a week. It explained that his hypervigilance while driving, constantly checking mirrors, scanning for danger, was a symptom of PTSD. His wrong turns weren't carelessness. They were panic attacks that disoriented him. His distraction wasn't laziness. It was his brain trying to process trauma. Everything Margaret had criticized him for, everything she had called him useless for, was actually proof of how much he was suffering. She tried calling the school district where David had worked, hoping they might have a way to contact him. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. It was after hours. She tried the number for the fire department that had given him the commendation. Also closed. Margaret drove back to her office, but she couldn't focus on anything. She tried working on contracts, but the words blurred on the page. She tried returning emails, but she couldn't think clearly enough to write coherent responses. Around 9 o'clock, Jennifer came back to the office. She had gone home earlier but returned when Margaret texted her. "Any luck?" Jennifer asked, setting a cup of coffee on Margaret's desk. Margaret shook her head. "He's gone. Moved out of his apartment. Phone disconnected. I can't find him." Jennifer sat down across from her. "The story is going viral online. People are sharing it everywhere. Someone posted about how David was your driver, and now people are asking questions." Margaret looked up. "What kind of questions?" Jennifer hesitated, then showed her phone again. The comments on social media were harsh. People were calling Margaret heartless, cruel, a terrible boss. Some were calling for boycotts of her company. The narrative was spreading fast. Successful businesswoman fires PTSD hero for symptoms of his trauma. Margaret read through the comments, each one like a knife in her chest. But she didn't care about her reputation right now. She didn't care about the company's image or potential lost business. She only cared about finding David and making this right. "I'll hire a private investigator," Margaret said suddenly. "Someone who can track him down. I don't care what it costs." "Ms. Chen," Jennifer said gently, "maybe there's another way." Jennifer pulled up another article on her phone. It was an older piece about David, an interview done shortly after the bus fire. At the end, the reporter mentioned that David spent his free time volunteering at a local veterans center, even though he wasn't a veteran himself. He helped with their PTSD support groups, finding community with others who understood trauma. The Riverside Veterans Center, Jennifer said. It's about 20 minutes from here. Maybe someone there knows how to reach him. Margaret grabbed her keys again. It was a long shot, but it was something. She had to try. As she headed for the door, Jennifer called after her. Miss Chen, for what it's worth, I think what you're doing now matters. Fixing mistakes is hard, but it's important. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she deserved any credit yet. She hadn't fixed anything. She had only destroyed something good. And now she was desperately trying to pick up the pieces. The real question was whether David would even want to hear her apology when she found him. The Riverside Veterans Center was nothing like Margaret expected. She had imagined something institutional, maybe cold and sterile. Instead, she found a modest brick building with warm lights glowing through the windows. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Welcome home." It was almost 10 o'clock at night when Margaret pulled into the small parking lot. She wasn't even sure if anyone would be there this late, but she had to try. As she approached the entrance, she could hear voices coming from inside. Through a window, she saw a group of people sitting in a circle talking. Margaret stood at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. What was she doing here? These people didn't know her. They had no reason to help her. She was the villain in this story, the one who had hurt someone they probably cared about. But she had come this far. She pulled open the door and stepped inside. The lobby was small and simple, with worn furniture and walls covered in photos. Margaret could see images of veterans, community events, and support group meetings. A young woman sat at a desk near the entrance, looking up in surprise. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. She had kind eyes but looked puzzled. They clearly didn't get many visitors in business suits at this hour. "I'm looking for someone," Margaret said, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. "His name is David Martinez. I was told he volunteers here sometimes." The woman's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Are you a friend of David's?" Margaret hesitated. What should she say? That she was his former boss who had just fired him? That she had spent the last 3 hours desperately trying to find him? That she had destroyed whatever little stability he had managed to build after his trauma? "I'm someone who hurt him," Margaret said finally, deciding on honesty. "And I need to apologize." The woman studied her for a long moment. "Wait here," she said, standing up and disappearing through a doorway. Margaret stood in the lobby, feeling more out of place than she ever had in her life. She could hear the murmur of voices from the other room, the sound of people sharing their stories, supporting each other. This was a community, she realized. These people understood pain in ways she never had. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s emerged from the doorway. He was tall, with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he had seen his share of difficulties. "I'm Robert," he said, extending his hand. "I run the center. Cindy says you're looking for David." Margaret shook his hand. "Yes, I'm Margaret Chen. I was David's employer until today when She paused, forcing herself to say it. "When I fired him." Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Recognition, maybe. I see. And why are you looking for him now?" "Because I made a terrible mistake," Margaret said, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know about the school bus, about what he went through. I fired him for symptoms of his PTSD without even trying to understand what was happening. And now I can't find him, and I need to make this right." Robert was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "David's not here tonight," he finally said. Margaret's shoulders sagged. "Do you know where I can find him, please? I know I don't deserve your help, but I need to talk to him. Even if I knew where he was, I'm not sure I should tell you," Robert said, though his tone wasn't unkind. "David's been through enough. The last thing he needs is more pressure." "I understand," Margaret said. "But please let me explain. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm not here to ease my own guilt. I'm here because David deserves better than what I gave him, and I want to try to fix what I broke." Robert gestured to a small seating area in the corner. "Sit with me for a minute." They sat in 2 old armchairs, and Margaret found herself pouring out the whole story. She told him about the 3 months of David's employment, about her frustration and impatience about the firing. She told him about discovering the truth too late, about the desperate search. about reading those articles and finally understanding what she had been blind to. I run a successful company, Margaret said, her voice hollow. I make decisions that affect hundreds of people. I thought I was good at reading people, at understanding situations, but I completely failed David. I saw what I wanted to see, what was convenient for me to see. Robert listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. David came here 3 days a week, Robert said quietly. Tuesday and Thursday evenings for group sessions, and Saturday mornings to help with our community breakfast. He never talked much in the beginning, just listened. But over the past few months, he started opening up. What did he say? Margaret asked, then immediately felt foolish. I'm sorry, that's probably private. Some of it is, Robert agreed. But I can tell you this. David blamed himself for not being able to return to his old job. He felt like he was letting people down, like his trauma made him weak. Taking the job with you was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to prove he could still be useful. The words hit Margaret like a punch. David had been trying to rebuild his life and she had torn it down. He talked about you once, Robert continued. A few weeks ago, he said his new boss was demanding but fair. He said he was worried he wasn't good enough, that he kept making mistakes. He was afraid of disappointing you. Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes. He was afraid of disappointing me. I'm the one who failed him. People with PTSD often blame themselves for their symptoms, Robert explained. They think they should be able to just get over it, move on, be normal again. Society tells them to be strong, to push through. So when they can't, they feel broken. Is there anything I can do? Margaret asked. Anything at all? Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There's a meeting happening right now in the next room. A PTSD support group. David was supposed to be here tonight, but he called earlier and said he couldn't make it. He didn't say why, but I can guess. Because of what happened today, Margaret said softly. Probably. But you know what? Some of the other people in that room have been where David is right now. They've lost jobs, lost relationships, felt like failures because of their trauma. Maybe hearing from you, hearing someone admit they were wrong, could help. Not just for David, but for all of them. Margaret looked toward the closed door where she could hear voices. You want me to talk to them? I want you to listen to them, Robert corrected. And maybe share your side too. Help them understand that sometimes people don't recognize PTSD because they've never experienced it. That ignorance isn't malice, even though it can cause real harm. Margaret felt her heart racing. The idea of walking into that room, facing people who were dealing with trauma, admitting what she had done, it terrified her. But wasn't that the least she could do? Okay, she said. I'll do it. Robert stood and led her to the door. Before opening it, he turned to her. One more thing. These people have been hurt before. Be honest with them. Don't try to make yourself look better than you are. They'll respect truth more than excuses. Margaret nodded, her mouth dry. Robert opened the door and she followed him inside. The room was arranged in a circle with about 12 people sitting in folding chairs. They all turned to look as Margaret entered, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. She saw men and women of various ages, different backgrounds, but they all had something in common. A certain look in their eyes that she now recognized. The weight of experiences that had changed them. Everyone, Robert said, this is Margaret. She's going through something difficult right now, and she's asked to speak with you. I think her story might be important for us to hear. Margaret stood there, feeling every eye on her. Her normal confidence, the self-assurance that carried her through business meetings and negotiations, was completely gone. She was just a person who had made a terrible mistake and was trying to understand how to fix it. Thank you for letting me be here, Margaret began, her voice shaky. I don't deserve your time, but I'm grateful for it. My name is Margaret Chen, and today I fired an employee named David Martinez for being what I called useless. 2 minutes later, I found out he was a hero who saved 23 children from a burning bus and is suffering from PTSD. She paused, seeing recognition dawn on several faces. They had seen the story online. They knew. I came here because I'm trying to find him, Margaret continued. But more than that, I came because I need to understand. I need to understand what I did wrong, how I missed something so important, and what I can do to make sure I never hurt someone like this again. A woman in her 30s raised her hand slightly. You said you fired him for being useless. What did he do that made you think that? Margaret took a breath and began explaining. She described David's wrong turns, his distractedness, his hesitation while driving. As she spoke, she saw several people in the circle nodding, exchanging glances with each other. When she finished, a man with a military tattoo on his forearm spoke up. "Everything you described, that's textbook PTSD. The hypervigilance, the difficulty concentrating, the panic in situations similar to the trauma." He wasn't being useless. He was surviving. "I know that now," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "But I didn't know it then. And that's what I can't forgive myself for. How could I be so blind?" An older woman with gray hair and gentle eyes spoke softly. "Because you've never lived it. Most people haven't. They see someone struggling and think they're lazy or incompetent. They don't see the battle happening inside." For the next hour, Margaret sat with these strangers who became teachers. They shared their own stories of losing jobs, of being misunderstood, of trying to explain invisible wounds to people who couldn't comprehend them. They told her about triggers she would never have recognized, about coping mechanisms that looked like character flaws, about the exhausting effort it took just to get through a normal day. And slowly, Margaret began to understand not just what had happened with David, but how many other people might be suffering in silence, judged and dismissed by people like her who simply didn't know better. When the meeting ended, Robert walked her back to the lobby. "That took courage," he said. "It took desperation," Margaret corrected. "But thank you for letting me learn from them." "David usually comes to our Saturday morning breakfast," Robert said quietly. "I can't promise he'll be there this week, but if he is, and if he's willing to see you, I'll let you know." Margaret handed him her business card. "Please, any time, day or night. I'll be there." As she drove home that night, Margaret felt different. The guilt was still there, heavy and real, but alongside it was something else. A determination to do better, to learn, to change. She had failed David, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make things right. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction she'd had with David over the past 3 months. All those moments she had dismissed as incompetence now looked completely different through the lens of understanding. By Friday morning, her office was buzzing with talk about the viral story. Several employees approached Jennifer asking if it was true, if Ms. Chen had really fired the hero from the news. Margaret held an emergency staff meeting at 9 o'clock. She stood in front of her 60 employees, many of whom had worked for her for years, and did something she rarely did. She admitted she was wrong. "By now, most of you have heard about David Martinez," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Everything you've heard is true. I fired him yesterday without knowing about his past, without understanding his struggle. I failed as a leader and as a human being." The room was silent. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm not here to make excuses," Margaret continued. "I'm here to tell you that I'm committed to doing better. Starting today, we're implementing a new employee support program, mental health resources, trauma-informed training for all management, and clear policies to protect employees who are dealing with invisible challenges." After the meeting, Margaret spent the day researching. She contacted workplace mental health specialists, read academic papers on PTSD, and reached out to organizations that helped trauma survivors. She wasn't just doing this for David anymore. She was doing it for every person who might walk through her doors carrying invisible burdens. Saturday morning arrived with no word from Robert. Margaret had been checking her phone obsessively, hoping for a message saying David would be at the breakfast. By 8 o'clock, she couldn't wait any longer. She drove to the Veterans Center. The parking lot was more crowded than it had been on Tuesday night. Margaret could smell coffee and bacon as she approached the entrance. Inside, the main room had been transformed. Tables were set up, volunteers were serving food, and dozens of people were eating and talking. Robert spotted her immediately and walked over. His expression was neutral and Margaret's heart sank. "Is he here?" she asked quietly. "He's here," Robert said. "But Margaret, he doesn't want to see you." The words hurt more than Margaret expected. "I understand. Can you at least give him a message from me?" "You can try talking to him yourself if you want," Robert said. "I told him you might come. He's outside in the courtyard, but I warned him. Whether he stays or leaves is up to him." Margaret's hands were shaking as she walked through the building toward the back exit. Through the glass door, she could see a small courtyard with a few benches and a garden. David was sitting alone on a bench holding a cup of coffee, staring at nothing. She pushed open the door and the sound made David look up. The moment he saw her, his expression hardened. He stood up ready to leave. "Please don't go," Margaret said quickly. "I'm not here to make excuses. I just need 5 minutes. If you want me to leave after that, I will." David remained standing, his body tense, but he didn't walk away. That was something. Margaret stepped closer but kept her distance, respecting his space. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I'm so deeply sorry for what I did to you. You deserved better. You deserved understanding, compassion, and support. Instead, I gave you criticism and judgment." David's jaw was tight. "You called me the worst driver you ever employed, I know. I said terrible things. Things I can never take back." Margaret felt tears threatening but pushed through. "I read about what you did, David. Those 23 children are alive because of you. You went into a burning bus 3 times. You saved them all. And then I couldn't even drive you to meetings on time," David said bitterly. "Some hero." "You are a hero," Margaret insisted. "Having PTSD doesn't change that. Struggling doesn't make you weak. I was wrong about everything." David finally sat back down, but he didn't invite her to join him. Margaret remained standing, feeling like she was on trial. She deserved to be. "Do you know what the worst part was?" David asked quietly. "It wasn't getting fired. I've been fired before after the bus incident when I couldn't do my old job anymore. The worst part was that you were right. I wasn't right." "You were," David interrupted. "I am bad at my job. I do make mistakes. I do get lost and confused. Every day I wake up and tell myself I'm going to do better, be better, and every day I fail. So when you said those things, you were just confirming what I already knew about myself." Margaret felt her heart breaking. She sat down on the bench, not next to David, but on the far end, giving him space. "That's not true. You're not failing. You're healing. There's a difference." "Doesn't feel like a difference." They sat in silence for a moment. Birds chirped in the small garden. Somewhere inside, people were laughing. "I went to a PTSD support group on Tuesday night," Margaret said finally. "Robert let me sit in. The people there taught me more in 1 hour than I learned in my entire life about what real strength looks like." David glanced at her, surprised. "They told me about hypervigilance," Margaret continued. "How your brain is constantly scanning for danger because it's trying to protect you from another trauma. That's why you were always checking mirrors, looking around. You weren't distracted. You were on high alert." "The doctors told me the same thing," David said. "Doesn't make it easier to live with." "And the wrong turns," Margaret said. "They explained how panic attacks can make you disoriented, how certain roads or situations can trigger your body's stress response. You weren't careless. You were triggered." David was quiet, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I'm not telling you this to show off what I learned," Margaret said softly. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that I see you now. Really see you, and I'm sorry it took losing you for me to open my eyes." "What do you want from me?" David asked. "Forgiveness? To feel better about what you did?" "No," Margaret said honestly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I came here to tell you that I'm starting a workplace mental health program at my company. Comprehensive support for employees dealing with trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, anything. I want to hire you to help develop it." David's head snapped toward her. "What?" "Not as my driver," Margaret said quickly. "Never as my driver. As a consultant. An advocate. Someone who can make sure we actually help people instead of hurting them. Someone who can train managers like me to recognize signs of struggle. Someone who can make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. You're serious, completely serious. I'll pay you twice what I was paying you before. You can work whatever hours you need, take whatever time off for therapy. You'll have full benefits, including mental health coverage. And if you want to speak publicly about your experience about PTSD in the workplace, I'll support that too." David stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Why would you do this?" "Because you're right that I can't undo what I did," Margaret said. "But maybe I can make sure it means something. Maybe we can help other people who are fighting battles no one else can see." "I don't know," David said slowly. "I need to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Margaret said, standing up. She pulled out a business card and set it on the bench between them. "That has my direct number. Call me when you're ready or don't call me at all. Either way, I'm moving forward with this program. But it would mean more with your voice in it." She started to walk away, then turned back. "And David? Those 23 children and their families know exactly who you are. They know your worth. I hope someday you can see yourself the way they see you. 2 weeks later, Margaret was in her office reviewing proposals for mental health providers when Jennifer knocked on her door. "Someone's here to see you," Jennifer said with a small smile. David walked in, looking nervous but determined. He was wearing a button-down shirt and carrying a folder. "I have some conditions," he said without preamble. Margaret gestured to the chair. "I'm listening. I want input on every aspect of the program. Real input, not just token consultation. I want to interview and approve any therapists you hire, and I want to start a support group at the company for employees dealing with trauma." "Done," Margaret said immediately. "And I want you to go through the same PTSD awareness training as everyone else. No special treatment because you're the boss." "Absolutely." David sat down and opened his folder. Inside were pages of notes, research, and ideas. "I've been working on this since you came to the center. I talked to Robert and some of the other people from the group. We have a lot of thoughts about what actually helps versus what companies usually do." For the next 3 hours they talked. Really talked. David shared his insights, his experiences, and his vision for what a truly supportive workplace could look like. Margaret listened, took notes, and asked questions. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She was finally learning to listen. As months passed, the program took shape. David became the voice of something bigger than both of them. He spoke at conferences, trained managers, and helped dozens of employees who were struggling in silence. He started a podcast about workplace mental health that reached thousands of people. Margaret discovered that her company didn't suffer from having more compassionate policies. If anything, productivity increased. Employees felt valued, supported, and more willing to ask for help before small problems became big ones. Other companies started reaching out, wanting to implement similar programs. The media coverage shifted too. Instead of the story being about a CEO who fired a hero, it became about a CEO and a hero who partnered to change workplace culture. They appeared together on news programs and magazine articles, at speaking events, but the most meaningful changes happened quietly, in one-on-one conversations with employees who admitted they were struggling, in the absence of shame around mental health, in the understanding that invisible wounds were just as real as visible ones. One evening, almost a year after that terrible Tuesday, David stopped by Margaret's office. "I got an email today," he said, "from a woman whose son has PTSD. She saw one of our interviews and said it gave her hope. She said her son had been afraid to tell his employer, but now he's going to ask for accommodations." Margaret smiled. "That's wonderful. You know what the weird thing is?" David said. "I spent months after the bus fire feeling worthless because I couldn't do my old job. I thought saving those kids was the most important thing I'd ever do. But maybe this, helping other people with trauma find support and understanding, maybe this matters just as much." "It does," Margaret said, "and for what it's worth, I'm grateful you gave me a second chance." "I didn't deserve it." "Maybe not," David agreed, "but I needed it. Not the job, but the proof that people can change, that mistakes don't have to be the end of the story." Margaret looked at the framed photo on her desk. It was from a company event a few months ago, a mental health awareness day that David had organized. In the photo, employees were sharing their stories, supporting each other, building community. She had learned that true success wasn't measured in deals closed or properties sold. It was measured in lives touched, in understanding offered, in the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the determination to do better. Sometimes the people we dismiss too quickly are the ones who teach us the most important lessons. And sometimes second chances change everyone involved.